Thank you very much for being here on this lovely Sunday morning. It reminds me of the old days when we used to get up early on a Sunday morning, go to church and hear the vicar give, not lectures, but sermons about serious matters. I'm glad that you're willing to face serious matters on a Sunday morning. I will do my best to imitate the vicar, though I promise to use some words that the vicar never did use, such as patriarchy, unemployment. Okay. I want to start out with the issue that Sue posed to us. Why spend, in the context of all about women, why spend some time talking all about blokes? And I want to start by assuring you that I will not be doing that on the grounds that we do hear from many commentators that women now have it all and it's men's turn now for some understanding and sympathy and special programs. In fact, it has been men's turn already. It's been men's turn for about 5,000 years. And I want to show you some of the historical proof of this. One of the first actual pieces of historical evidence about masculinity. From very early Egyptian history, this is a representation of the pharaoh Nama from the first dynasty, who in some Egyptian stories was the founder of the ancient kingdom of Egypt. And you can see he was credited with having united Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt into the great civilization. And you can see him here engaged in the practice of unifying the Lower Egypt with Upper Egypt through a technique which has come down to us as a central part of dominant forms of masculinity. One could imagine our Malcolm, for instance, feeling very much like doing this to Bill as the parliamentary drama unfolds. So there is a strong, a great and a very ancient social tradition of the making of honoured forms of masculinity through exercises of social domination. And that continues into our own day, obviously. If you look at the top transnational corporations which run the economy of the world, as the Fortune magazine in the United States does every year, Fortune, at its last count, listed the top 500 transnational corporations in the world and counted the number of men and women who were chief executive officers of them. And you know what? More than 95% of them were men. So top levels of economic power are still substantially a monopoly of men. Privileged groups of men, of course, highly privileged, but nevertheless in gender terms, that's where the power still lies. And this is true not only in the corporate world, but also in the political world. Here, for instance, is the ruling party of China, the Communist Party of China. This is a meeting of its Central Committee. Count the women. How many do you get? I think there are 3 if you look really hard. But that's, not uncommon in the elite power groups in political systems around the world. So if Hillary Clinton actually gets up in the coming presidential election in the United States, she will be the first woman in that office in the more than 200 years that the United States political system has existed. And if you look at the other key form of power in the world, that is military power, you're looking at a stack of male generals, admirals, and Air Force commanders too. So it's been men's turn in those terms, in terms of where power resides in society for a very long time. It's still the case. And for that reason, I have to say I'm not tremendously enthused when I hear talk about how there's a crisis of masculinity going on in our culture. That seems to me extremely implausible when we look at the actual distribution of power and resources in the world. But there is still cultural change about masculinity going on. We might even say that there's a kind of crisis of stereotypes about men and masculinities. There is still, a conception of true masculinity being a kind of hard, hairy phenomenon, which is sort of naturally the centre of attention, naturally on top. So we still have our media full of images like this, representations, popular representations of admirable masculinities, with women on the margins, almost literally on the sidelines, cheering the blokes on. Now, that image of there being one true masculinity, which is displayed for us by our footballers, is deep-seated, but there's a lot of research evidence that it's fundamentally wrong, that the realities of human life show an enormous variety of forms of masculinity, of ways of being a man that can be found if you go looking. The anthropologists, for instance, have gone looking in the course of their trawling of different cultures around the globe, and they have provided us, in fact, with some of the most dramatic evidence of the different forms of masculinity and the different ways of being a man that a society can produce and honour. So, for instance, anthropologists have found communities, societies in the world in which all of the young men are homosexual, actually engage in homosexual practices and not in heterosexual practices. It's the kind of place where Corey Bernardi would feel right at home. And if you're wondering how the societies reproduce themselves, the answer is all the young men turn heterosexual at a later stage of life, marry and have children. Those are communities which simply organise human sexuality in a different way from the way we do, where being a true man is regarded as necessarily being heterosexual. There are many varieties, many ways of organising our sexual lives, which you can find. And that fact of there being multiple forms of masculinity in the world, multiple ways of being a man, is true within the same society, within our society, for instance. If you go looking in institutions like schools or workplaces, you'll often find significantly different patterns of masculinity there. People living along different kinds of trajectories. I was once doing research in a school which I won't name, but it's quite a well-known elite private school where we were interviewing the kids about their way of life and their images and so forth. And it turned out that there was quite a dominant, a hegemonic form of masculinity in the school, which was exhibited by the boys in the first 15, so to speak, and they were conventionally known around the school as the jocks. Okay, there you have it. But the school didn't only depend on the rugby players for its prestige. There was another group, another kind of masculinity, which the same school actually needed for its academic performances, which was part of its marketing strategy. And the boys who were good at schoolwork, getting the top marks in the exams rather than on the football field, were widely known around the school as the Cyrils. And the interesting thing is the school needed both. It wouldn't function well without the two different kinds of masculinity. And that situation, a little bit dramatic in that case, is not at all unusual. More than that, as our economy, our social institutions, our social arrangements and culture changes, we get new forms of masculinity, just as we get new forms of femininity emerging, and indeed they're interrelated. So as we get new industries, for instance, with new technology or transformations of the economic structure, we get shifts in the most honoured and prestigious forms of masculinity. So let me show you another example of this to contrast with the image we've had there. Anyone recognise him? Okay, we're much more familiar with him in middle age, of course, but if you don't, this is Steve Jobs as a young lefty about the time they were involved in inventing the first Mac. And the high-tech industries have actually been a quite interesting site for the emergence of different patterns of masculinity associated with certain kind of power and a lot of money, but not the super aggressive jock physical power model of a dominant form of masculinity. And those changes too are flowing through to younger generations apart from this. Okay, so we need to think about the material base of what's happening in gender relations, of how we construct our masculinities and femininities. And here I think we need to remember what the material situation of the bulk of men and the bulk of women actually is. There is, for instance, a long-established wage gap, as the economists put it, to the advantage of men in general and the disadvantage of women. And there's an interesting debate about how big and how stable the wage gap is. According to some economists, the difference in income between men and women attributable to gender prejudice, to attitudes, is actually very small, around about 3% if you compare women and men with exactly the same training, in exactly the same job, with exactly the same levels of experience. But of course all of those things are not usually equal. If you compare all women with all men, and this is the figure you usually see in the media, all women and all men who are full-time workers, so full-time, equivalent full-time wage rates, the difference is around 17%, and that hasn't changed much for 20 years in Australia. So the economic marginalisation of women has remained quite stable. But that figure itself is a radical underestimate of the true level of economic inequality across women and men in total. So if we look at for instance, superannuation entitlements as a better indication of the cumulative income that women and men have over a working life, the average superannuation entitlement for women in Australia at the moment is around 60% of the average entitlement of men, and a larger number of women don't have any super entitlement at all, just outside the system. So the level of overall economic inequality in gender terms in our country is much greater than those conventional wage gap measures would suggest. And that has deep roots in our way of life, in the division of labour between men and women in households, the very large difference that still exists in the percentage of housework that is done by women and men, in the much greater, enormously greater proportion of women who actually leave work to care for young children, which is work that men can do, but very few of them do. And it's in that context of large differences, large economic differences between men as a group and women as a group, and major differences in domestic labour and care work, that the classic hegemonic masculinity in Australian society was formed. The kind of thing that we see if we get hold of a copy of Women's Weekly from the 1950s, where the men wear fedoras and the women wear aprons, the notion of masculinity as necessarily involving being a breadwinner. So being a good man was to be a good breadwinner, being able to support a wife and child in the home. And that was, to a certain extent, an economic reality in the first half of the 20th century. The wage rates were set for that purpose, with women's wages markedly lower than men's, and men's calculated on the basis that a man was supposed to be supporting breadwinning for a whole family. But that was then, and this is now. That economic system has been dismantled. We're now in a neoliberal era. Our economy has moved. We've basically dismantled the manufacturing industries we used to have. We've shifted to high-tech mining, which employs many, many fewer people. We've dismantled much of the old wage system. We've created new economic pressures and new economic needs. And that economic change, that change in the nature of our productive system in Australia, has had a particular impact on particular groups of men. It's particularly impacted working class youth, so that it's in the groups who in earlier generations would have looked forward to a life of stable employment, for instance, in heavy industry, in trades, and the like, where there's now, very large-scale structural unemployment and unemployment, the western suburbs of Sydney, western suburbs of Melbourne, northern suburbs of Adelaide, where what work young working class men can look forward to is mostly casual. It's not the kind of thing on which you can buy a house and expect to support a family. In consequence, there's a high level of educational disengagement among this particular group of young men. So if we are actually looking for a crisis of masculinity, that I think is where we find it. And it's due not to eating quiche, but to eating dirt. And it's those young men who, of course, are targeted by the media and by right-wing politicians in fear campaigns. So we have a fairly constant drumbeat of excitement and anxiety about gangs, about one-punch killings, about young men loose on the street. We hear this in the rhetoric of Donald Trump, the thing about how Mexico is sending rapists into the United States. We hear undertones of this in the rhetoric about border protection in this country and the war on terror. So a lot of our public life nowadays, a lot of the drama of our public life is constructed, in effect, as a masculinity confrontation between dangerous masculinities, of whom working class lads within Australia are one form, but the loose and dangerous men outside are another, and the protections erected by our political authorities. Now, to say that that's a drama, and to a considerable extent a fictional drama, is not to deny gender-based violence. Women are vulnerable to a whole range of forms of violence from men. Family violence, we know, everybody at this event, I'm sure, appreciates the simple realities that most gender-based violence is actually in the home and from men who are perfectly well known to the victims. But there's also institutional violence of the kind that we see in that dreadful Australian concentration camp in Nauru. And in some parts of the world, there are more severe forms of collective violence again. I've been involved for some years in a solidarity group called Sydney Action for Juarez, which responded to a call from Mexican feminists for solidarity around a situation which some of you will know about in the border city of Juarez, northern Mexico, where a whole lot of young women were turning up dead, their bodies in the desert around, found in the desert around Juarez, often extremely brutally treated. A situation where there was complicity from the state, from police, ignorance and disregard from the authorities who should have been dealing with it. That became a massive international scandal, and I have to say that, it was so severe that Mexican feminists invented the term femicide to describe this collective violence against women, and femicide is by no means, although the situation in Juarez has improved a bit, is still found in far too many parts of the world. Now, this level of violence, both the routine violence in our homes and the extreme violence of camps and situations like Juarez, is not something that we can attribute to the biology of men. This is not due to a male brain which is programmed for violence in the way too many of our myth makers still claim. It arises, and there's lots and lots of research on gender-based violence now, on which we can, from which we can get a picture of the real background to this. It arises from situations of social instability and poverty to some extent, though violence occurs in all social levels in our society too. But especially where there are models of masculinity, hegemonic masculinities, which emphasise the dominance of men over women and the dominance of men over other men too. And in those situations, a point which is, I think, very creative insight that has come out from the work of some of our criminologists, is that violence does not express a pre-existing masculinity so much as it's done in order to make masculinity, to claim an honoured form of masculinity, which is a different dynamic altogether, but is not actually particularly new. Here's an example from the most famous recruiting poster in the First World War. "You're not a proper man, Daddy, unless you signed up for the trenches," is the message. And that is the pattern, that is the dynamic involved in quite a lot of other forms of gendered violence. And I find this, a particularly troubling insight, because so much cultural work is done in our mass media to create that impression that an honoured masculinity is one that involves dominance, especially physical dominance. Here's one of my favourite Australian newspaper headlines. It's from a little time back. Some of you will remember the time when there was a 100th anniversary of rugby in Australia, and that was the leading Sydney newspaper's headline about the celebratory test. Now, it's worth remembering. One can simply just get so one can get shattered by some of this stuff. And it's worth remembering, and the case of the trenches is a perfectly clear example, that in much masculine violence, much gendered violence, it's men also, or men predominantly, who are getting hurt. It was in fact mainly men who were killed in war. That has changed as war has increasingly targeted civilian populations, but it's still the case that in many forms of masculine violence it is other men who are targeted. And it's also worth remembering that those same statistics that give us our pretty horrifying indications of the number of women who suffer domestic violence or rape in the course of their lives also give us evidence that the majority of men are not actually violence, are not physically violent. Though very large numbers of men are complicit in the cultural constructions of masculinity that actually support gender-based violence. Nevertheless, those things about men are also worth remembering, that men also can be targets of gender violence, and many men are not complicit in it. So they're also good guys, which is important to remember. Some of my best friends are men. And some do better than just being good guys. Some are actively out there on the front line working for gender equality and against gender-based violence. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with some forms of this. Most of you have probably heard of the White Ribbon Campaign. Some of you may even have been involved in it, an international program against violence against women, which began in Canada in the wake of that terrible massacre by a crazy young man of women in an engineering school in Canada, and has since spread from Canada to many other parts of the world. It's one of the most effective community-based anti-violence programs there is. Australia has not been absent from this scene either. So I'd like to mention at the University of Wollongong, we have now, I shouldn't say we have, but the colleagues there have created the Centre for Research on Men and Masculinities, one of the few such centres in the world. They have been pioneers in this area, and a good deal of their work is directed towards men's engagement in gender equality work and anti-violence work. This is something that's also happened in Australian schools. So here's an example, a somewhat old example, but a very nice one, of a program that was developed by a group of teachers, mostly men, teachers, for teenage boys, to create a safe space within Australian high schools for talking about questions of gender relations, sexuality, identity, and the problems that teenage boys do face in shaping their lives in relation to the gender order. And that kind of thing, I mean, that's an older example, but it is still going on. The Safe Schools program, which is currently so much at issue, is a descendant of this kind of work in schools, and an admirable program too. And in setting up this kind of educational work, teachers have one great asset, and that is that the boys are interested in these issues. Most boys actually want to know about sexuality, about gender, about possible pathways for themselves, about future relations, about what's happening among girls and women. This is stuff that boys really want to know as well as need to know, and you can therefore, provided you're not harassed too much by the politicians and the school managers, you can develop very interesting educational work with boys around these themes. Finally, I want to mention the men who, not in public arenas, but in private arenas, including the House, are working at an everyday level towards more equal gender relations. I'm thinking, for instance, of the rather small and often laughed at pioneering group of house husbands, that is, men who have actually taken on the principal role of caring for young children while their women partners are winning the bread. It does happen. And there is considerably more involvement now than even a generation ago of men in the care of young children, which I find one of the most encouraging things, I guess, in everyday life, to see examples of that around my suburb. Of course, the men who begin to undertake serious childcare don't always quite get it right. So here's an example of someone who is trying to combine their engagement in the economy with childcare, and it's not quite working, so you can make mistakes. And we have to allow a certain amount of space for these mistakes to be worked through. But I find this still a very hopeful picture. I mean, as someone who is making a bit of an effort, and there is much work to be done, but there's some social movement going on in conventions and understandings of masculinity. So my message then is, don't give up on men. Some of them are indeed incorrigible shits, and we keep electing them to Parliament, but many are not. Some are seriously trying to change conventions and practices like these. And it's worth remembering that when the women's movement has made major advances in establishing, in institutionalising women's rights, advances in women's economic position, equal opportunity measures, anti-discrimination measures, even going back to when we won the vote, it has almost always been in alliance with groups of progressive men. I think that's a truth about our political history that is still true and still important for the strategy of change. So that's where I will end, with this hopeful image above, and the thought that even a few good men in alliance with a stroppy women's movement can actually change our gender system. Thank you.